Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. As we mentioned in last week's episode, one of the things we're doing here over the holiday season is gearing up for our recordings for 2021. But in doing so, we're taking a look back by resubmitting to our listening audience a couple of our episodes from the past. One that was my favorite and one that Alexis's favorite. Today, this is going to be Alexis's favorite, which was episode 21, The Sinking White Egg Basket. That goes back far enough that some of the newer listeners to the show may not have heard that episode, so I think you'll enjoy it. And so we just ask you to stay tuned now, stay through the break here, and when we come back, we'll pick back up with what was episode 21, coming back at you again, The Sinking White Egg Basket. Thanks. Alexis and Don taking just a quick break from the podcast here. Normally this is where we would have an ad or a mention. I think that's the inside term that we're supposed to, brand mention is what they're called, at least on the website when we're loading an episode. But today I'm just going to directly appeal for one of the other ways that you can help the podcast, where you may not get as much directly back in return as we do from the others, but still something that's important. So, Lex, what is Patreon?
So Patreon is a platform where actually you can go and support the podcast that you love, including A Fork in Time.
Yeah, and it's not just podcast there. Patreon is probably the number one platform for artists and folks who have various things to be supported on. So podcasts frequently are there, but it can be YouTube channels, it can be the other things that are there. But basically it's your opportunity to become a subscriber or a patron, hence Patreon, for the show. So here at A Fork in Time, we do have a few patrons, and we appreciate them. It doesn't cost a tremendous amount of money to put on a podcast, but it does cost money. And so over time, one of the ways that you can help us defray the cost of the podcast, we've been able to use some of the money to upgrade the equipment that we use. Hopefully you notice that from time to time, is actually by supporting us on Patreon. So Alexis, how does someone find how to support us on Patreon?
Just go to the link in the show notes. You'll see a Patreon link and click on that and you'll get all set up.
Yeah, the other place you can go is actually to our website, which is www.aforkintimepodcast.com. There's a Patreon link there, as well as other non-monetary ways that you can support the show. Alexis and I have said this a number of times. We did not start a podcast to retire on. It's not that lucrative, particularly not a niche podcast about alternate history. But still there are costs in doing that. So if you can help us out either through financial or non-financial means, we certainly would appreciate it. And we appreciate, again, the fact that we have built a global audience of what we think of as being our little community. And so we invite you to be part of that. Anything else you want to say about that, Lex?
Just thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it. I'm going to call myself your host, but the truth of the matter is, and you can hear by the laughter here, I'm being joined by Alexis, who's actually going to be co-hosting this episode, but probably doing most of the lead. And the reason we can assume that we're doing most of the lead is, what country might we be visiting, Alexis?
You think England?
It's possible. We are approximately about 20 episodes into the history of this podcast, and I think our avid, faithful listeners have already discovered that there's a better than even chance, although not an exclusive chance, that if Alexis is involved in an episode, we're going to be visiting England or something in English history. And for this particular episode, guess what?
That'd be correct.
They'd be correct. That's exactly right.
There's a lot of English history, guys.
There's a lot of history. There's a lot of history, and a lot of it is English. Particularly for those of us even that are Americans who derive from that being part of our heritage in terms of our history as well. So the episode that we're going to explore, though, today is, I guess, probably not a widely known element of English history, but I think in doing the research here and understanding and the conversations that we've had off podcast, I hate to say off air because it's not like we're being broadcast anywhere, but off podcast, is that it's probably not one of the more widely known elements of English history, but sets up a lot of English history for the several hundred years that follows.
Correct. It's one of those things that I think a lot of people know what comes as a result of this incident, but don't necessarily know the incident itself.
Okay, so without holding our listeners in suspense anymore, the incident that we're going to be focusing on is actually the sinking or the shipwreck of what is known as the White Ship. And this happens in... When does this happen, Lex?
This happens on November 25th of 1120. So we're going pretty far back in the Wayback Machine today.
Exactly. And we're going back to the period of time where this is an English monarchy. So this is, less than 100 years removed, though, from the Norman conquering of England. So there's still this relationship that's existing between what we think of as being France,
yes,
territories, modern France, and the territory that the island of that we will come to know as England, Britain, the various things that it's known throughout history. So this is that period of time shortly after the Norman conquest, and we have the situation here where the monarchy in England is going to eventually become up for grabs as a result of this event during a period that's known as what?
The Anarchy.
The Anarchy. So when I hear Anarchy, and I was telling Alexis, I've studied a little bit for this episode of the podcast, but I haven't studied a lot. So you might think of me as the listener that's here that's getting to participate in the conversation today. When we say the Anarchy, what are we talking about, Alexis?
When we say anarchy in this case, we are talking about essentially the succession crisis that comes about as a result of this event. To kind of set the stage a little bit, the main players in this event are Henry I, which you mentioned that we're not that far removed from the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror. We're actually talking about William the Conqueror's grandson.
Okay.
In this instance. If anybody's familiar with horrible histories, look them up on YouTube. They do a song where they actually go through the kings and queens of England. So I actually have William, Henry, Stephen, Henry, Richard, John going through my head right now. Side note. Historical side note. But we're not that far removed from the Battle of Hastings and William the Conqueror coming over. We're talking about Henry I of England. In this particular instance, his one legitimate son, William, probably named after his grandfather and father, actually, he ultimately perishes. He dies in this incident. And we'll come to why that actually leads to the anarchy as we go through this. But that kind of sets the stage for this. We have Henry I is on the throne. He's got a son named William. That William, unfortunately, loses his life in this incident.
Okay, so the result of the incident, which is the sinking or the shipwreck or the loss of the White Ship, is eventually going to lead to this period of the anarchy, which is a secession dispute over the English crown, the new English crown as a result of the Norman conquest. I guess that's an important thing to sort of understand, and we probably will end up doing a podcast episode someday on what would have happened if there had been no Battle of Hastings and no Norman conquest, because much of what we understand and know about the history of England and the history of Europe, actually, from that point forward, is obviously influenced by that event.
Yes, I did a whole paper on that in college.
Well, there you go. So, again, part of the reason that when we often talk English history, obviously Alexis is the one who leads those episodes here. So, one of the things that I'm just curious about, I don't even know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it, because if I were a listener listening right now, I'd be wondering, why is it called the White Ship? Is it really white?
So, it's called the White Ship probably because it looked white. It might have been whitewashed or something like that. So, yeah, it's kind of a nickname. It actually probably wasn't named the White Ship. But yeah, it's a nickname because of its appearance.
Okay. And from what I understand from doing some of the reading here in the preparation, this was a newly built, if you will, sort of state-of-the-art.
Yeah, this was like the cream of the crop. This ship was not supposed to go down.
Okay. And so the reason it was, again, a sort of a new ship, a well-designed, it was actually sort of intended to do the purpose that it was doing, which was transporting nobility, to make it easy for them to make the trip across the English Channel. So who is on the ship, and why is the person that's on the ship important?
So several people are on the ship, but probably the most important on the ship, we've touched on him, is the son of Henry I, William. You might see him referred to as William Adeline. That is a normicized version of an Anglo-Saxon word Etheling, which basically means son of the king. So it's just a delineation that he is the heir to the throne. He's the son of the king. So he's the bigwig on the ship, for lack of a better word. And one of the important things to remember about Henry I is he has a lot of kids, very few of which are legitimate. He's got a lot of illegitimate kids by a bunch of mistresses. So the reason William is so important is because he's the one legitimate son that Henry's got. So he kind of, for lack of a better word, has all his eggs in one basket when it comes to William.
Or in this case, all of his eggs in one white ship.
Yes.
That's crossing from
Barfleur, which is in France.
Back to England, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, new ship. The ship is sailing back to England with the heir, the designated heir, the recognized heir. And while there are others who, I guess, have claims to the throne, nobody quite has a claim like William. Is that a fair thing to say?
Correct. He definitely has the top claim to the throne.
Okay. So, again, as we often do here on A Fork in Time, we're going to take the fork of if the ship had not sunk. But before we can go down the what if, we need to go down what I sometimes am starting to refer to in my head as the what did
Yes.
of history. So, the ship sinks, and as a result of that, the heir, William, is lost.
Yes.
So, in the real timeline, what follows from that short term and then later long term?
So in the real timeline, Henry I also does have a legitimate daughter. Her name is Matilda. And Matilda is married off to a couple people. First, she's married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Then she's married to Geoffrey Plantagenet. You might recognize that name. It will become important. So she's married off. And basically what Henry does is says, I need the nobles to recognize my daughter as my legitimate heir. And the nobles actually all agreed to do that while Henry is alive. They say, yes, we will back Matilda. Of course, she's married. The assumption is she will have heirs, and so it's like, we have no problem backing her. Then Henry dies, and that kind of goes out the window. So it opens the door for a cousin of Matilda. His name is Stephen. He comes from another child of William I, so they were able to make the cousin switch. He was able to say, you don't want a woman on the throne, do you? You want a man. You want somebody strong. He's able to swoop in. And of course, Matilda's not in position in England at the time to take the throne. She's with her husband. So Stephen is very quickly able to swoop in, usurp the throne, and that is ultimately what leads to what becomes the Anarchy. It's that fight between Matilda and Stephen, because Matilda is like, I'm the legitimate heir. I'm the one that should have the crown. And Stephen's like, well, you're a woman. No.
So the unusual thing there is that there's obviously the idea of primogeniture, the oldest child, the oldest son is the heir. It was not traditionally the case in the English monarchy. It does happen later, but at this point, it's not traditional for a woman to assume the throne.
At this point, if we're not counting Boudica, which it's questionable about if she was actually even a real person, it's possible that no queen has ever existed in English history at this point. So it's not even a foreign concept. It's a completely alien concept to the people of England.
Okay, and so under that circumstance, even though the nobles had agreed, they were breaking to some degree with tradition. Not saying that they could not have kept their word and that wouldn't have happened, but what Henry had put into place once he realized he was not going to have a male heir was a compromise position at best. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Absolutely.
And so that's when he's not around to keep the nobles honest to the agreement. And other forces come into play. That's when you kick off this war of succession, which is called the Anarchy. So, when is this actually resolved, if ever, in the real timeline?
In the real timeline, this is actually not ultimately what I would consider resolved until 1154.
Okay.
We got quite a few years to go. And the only reason it is resolved is because Stephen, who's the king, for all intents and purposes, lack of a better word, he ultimately agrees I'm not going to have my heir. He does have a son. I'm not going to have my heir declared the next King of England. I'm going to recognize Matilda's son, who will actually become Henry II.
Okay. Now, Henry II, without chasing the real history too far, because that deviates from what we do here on a Fork in Time, but Henry II is well known as a monarch of England. There's later going to be an important marriage that Henry engages in to Eleanor of Aquitaine. If you've never seen the classic movie or the stage play The Lion in Winter, I would recommend you do so.
Yeah, you're missing out.
It covers some of these events, but we're not going to go down that path. So eventually there is a settlement to this period of time known as the Anarchy, and it sort of ends up with, I guess you could argue, is it a fair thing to say, it ends up with who would have been Matilda's heir, probably eventually taking the throne, but it's delayed, it's in question, and so certainly it's not a smooth transition.
Correct, yeah. Ultimately, Henry II probably would have become king if his mother had been queen. That would have been the natural succession. And that was actually what Henry I was getting at. Matilda was married. It was the assumption she was going to have kids, and those kids were going to be boys. So that's really what the plan was all along. We just have this usurping of Stephen, and it takes a while to get back to what the path of history was planned to be all along.
Okay. Does this, and I'm just asking this question again, somewhat out of ignorance. Again, think of this being a little different than our normal episode here. I'm the listener who doesn't know any better, asking questions. Does this sow the seeds for anything of what we know later as being the War of the Roses or any of the other contention over the English crown? In other words, is this a temporary settlement that sort of erupts again, or is it actually really, really settled when Henry II assumes the throne?
I think it's sort of settled in that it kind of brings things back to where it should, but obviously we have the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II, and that opens up a whole other window that ultimately probably does lead to the War of the Roses, because we're going back over to France. We're allying with France again with that marriage. Another podcast I listen to, Rex Factor, I'm going to plug it a little bit. They like to refer to the holdings of that are obtained by Eleanor of Aquitaine as the left of France. That's what ultimately is the holdings of England. It's like we have England and the left of France. So yeah, I think ultimately, while it's settled, it does kind of sow those seeds because we have this alliance with France and this kind of opening of cousins and things that never really go away in monarchy, so yeah. Okay.
So that's talking about the real timeline. So just to summarize it very quickly, because we spent a lot of time covering this, but important to lay the foundation. Henry I is king, loses his only recognized legitimate male heir in the sinking of the White Ship. That leads to the deal that had been struck after that, before he dies, that his daughter will assume the throne, being not carried through by nobles and monarchy. There's, as far as who's going to be the monarchy, there's a contested period over the throne called the Anarchy. Ultimately, it gets resolved as a result of, I guess, what they would refer to as the usurper, the cousin Stephen, agreeing to allow his grandson to assume the throne, but that's after approximately a 30-year period of time where there's a contest that goes on over the throne, and obviously the disruptions that go with that.
Correct.
For a self-proclaimed student of English history, did I do a pretty good job of summarizing the period?
You did a pretty good job of summarizing, of giving the 30,000-foot view.
Okay, and again, we're up for the high view there. So again, this is an alternate history podcast. That's what happened. We're going to talk about what could have happened.
Yes.
So obviously the first thing is you actually have William as a surviving legitimate male heir. So what difference does that make?
Well, he was married. He had a French wife, I believe. So ultimately, if he survives, has children with his wife, we have no reason for Matilda to ever be in line for the throne, because as we have the son having children, she gets pushed down. So ultimately, we never have Matilda, who, even if she had a son named Henry, does he become Henry II? Probably not. So that opens up this huge chasm of we don't have Henry II coming to the throne. Maybe he doesn't marry Eleanor of Aquitaine. Maybe we don't have the possessions in France coming into play. Maybe we don't have a Richard I, a John. That could go way far down the line, just by the fact that William Ethling, that's what I'm going to call him to delineate, because we got a lot of Williams being thrown around. If William Ethling becomes king, we have no reason for Matilda to ever be queen, or to even have her children be anywhere near the line of succession.
Okay, and we've had other episodes where we've talked about some of the things that relate to other Henrys in English history. I know we end up with 8 of them. That part I'm very sure of. It happens to be the time of year here in the Houston area where we're moving towards the fall, and we actually have a Renaissance festival that occurs not far outside the city. And so there are billboards all over the place now where I see the likenesses of Henry VIII.
Oh, yeah. If you're going to the Texas Renaissance Festival, the king, it's Henry VIII.
It's Henry VIII, yeah. And so we ultimately have a Henry VIII. Prior to a Henry VIII, obviously, way back in the day, we had a Henry I and ultimately Henry II. What would be different if William lives to be Henry I's heir is the person who would have become, or did become, Henry II would not have been a logical person in line to the throne.
Correct. He would have been in line to the throne, but so far down that he would have ended up being a duke. He probably would have been, in Parliament, well, what becomes Parliament, in the Privy Council, but not anywhere near the throne.
Okay, so one of the departures here in our fork in time is, if William survives to be the rightful heir, then there's no contest, obviously, over the throne. And ultimately, the way that gets resolved doesn't get resolved that way. So the fact that there's a resolution in the Anarchy period that ends up with Henry II becoming the king is important in the real timeline, but it's a total would not have happened likely scenario in an alternate timeline, because it was only as a result of the settlement in the real timeline that even comes into being.
Correct.
So the character that we know, and he was a character in history, the character that we know as Henry II is not part of the equation moving forward and the things that happen from there. So that's one of the differences. The obvious difference is William would have been king. William dies, so he's not king. But the reason that's important is it changes who the future king of the future line would be.
Right.
Okay. What else is a potential departure in an alternate timeline if there's no sinking of the white ship?
Another potential departure is, I mentioned that Henry I does have a lot of illegitimate children that are still noble. They're illegitimate, but they still have status. So possibly, if we have William Ethling succeeding to the throne, is it possible that we have these half siblings being married off to other noble houses of Europe and kind of furthering the line and furthering the family tree that way, if he's in a position of power to kind of help his siblings kind of gain more positions of power? That's another interesting kind of thing to think about. If William Ethling is in power, how can he help his extended family instead of this situation where we have kind of the most famous is Robert of Gloucester is the half-brother of Matilda, and he actually fights on her behalf, actually ends up dying on her behalf. He's kind of the main one. But if William Ethling is succeeding, he's got all this extended family that is illegitimate but still has this position of power. So how do those kind of get parlayed out? Do some of them get married off to France, maybe even become, members of the church? How does that ultimately change the power structure of Europe and the landscape of political power in Europe?
Okay, so it may have been a situation where if England, the right word to use?
The right word to use.
Okay, if England is not essentially in a civil war or a contested period over the monarchy again as a result of the sinking, and then subsequently Matilda not being allowed to carry through with what was originally promised, a period of peace exists in England, and so England could have focused more externally, perhaps with these marriages or other influences. They could have focused on external affairs as opposed to being focused on the internal crisis known as the Anarchy.
Correct.
And so the result of that could have been a different outcome in European history and English history relative to European history in that particular period because of just not having to deal with those forces.
Correct.
Now, this particular period in English history may be familiar to some who have either read the novel or perhaps seen the miniseries that was created, a popular book called The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. So, as I recall, I've not read the novel, but I've seen the miniseries. This is about the building of a cathedral, correct?
Yes.
Go ahead.
But the backdrop of the show and the book, Pillars of the Earth, is this whole period of time known as the Anarchy.
And what we were just talking about again off podcast was the fact that there's lots of starts and stops in the building of this cathedral. And the reason that there are stops and starts is...
It's this constant seesaw of Matilda's in power, no Stephen's in power, no Matilda's in power, no Stephen's in power. So you're having this issue of the permits that are needed, the supplies that are needed, the everything that is required to do something like build this massive cathedral. It's like, okay, who do we need to go to for that now? So it takes so much longer. In fact, the ending scene of Pillars of the Earth is the cathedral is now finished, and it's kind of that, you know, I kind of call it the bookend of any kind of English miniseries. It's like they're telling the whole story, and it's like, you know, Henry II's on the throne. Everything's good now. Cathedral's done. We got through it.
Right, and so that's a you know, I don't want to use the word popular culture, but that's a literary reference to a period of time that there was real disruption going on in the country. Obviously, this is an example of that contained in a book, and then in something that was produced into a miniseries. But there were other things that were obviously being disrupted, as we've talked about before, as a result of the anarchy.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about a lot in terms of like court life and things that were going on in court life, but one of the other things that gets touched on in Pillars of the Earth is just the fact that people are trying to have fairs to sell their goods, and it's like, well, that fair was legal last year, now suddenly not, because our permit, for lack of a better word, has been revoked because the permit was given by Matilda. Well, now it's Stephen. So it was actually affecting everybody, even the common man who was just trying to sell some wool. It wasn't just on the court level, the high level.
Okay. And as we've talked about before, one of the other outflows of the real timeline is eventually Henry II becomes king. And eventually he's going to be married to a very influential, powerful woman.
Yes.
Eleanor of Aquitaine. And that produces... There was already the connection, we talked about this before, because it's the Normans that come and take England. That's the 1066 date that we're referencing there. But the events of Henry II and the subsequent events tie England and France even
closer together.
Yeah. So... is one of the counterfactuals that you would suggest here, one of the alternatives is if there's William that survives, thus there's no Henry II as we know Henry II to be, the relationship that might have existed between England and France might have somehow been different?
Might have been a little more cordial, probably. Wouldn't have had... I think one of the things that ultimately comes out of the marriage between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II is, of course, there's infighting between their kids, brought on by their parents, to a large extent. But then you have these rival factions between people who both have claims to thrones and claims to titles and things like that. If you have no Henry II, no Eleanor of Aquitaine, you have just a continuation with William. There's not that contention of fighting between siblings and between different parts of the family, because it just kind of continues.
So is it a fair thing to say or not a fair thing to say? Again, I'm playing the inquisitive listener here for this particular podcast episode. England and France are at war for a long period of time for European history in the what I think of as the first half of the second millennium. That's a recurring theme there. Does the possibility exist in an alternate timeline with no sinking of the White Ship that there's not as much conflict that exists in the way that we think of that conflict having existed between England and France?
I think definitely.
And that would be because...
It would be because, going back to the fact we're not that far removed from 1066, and we have the Duke of Normandy coming over and taking the throne of England, if he's got a successful dynasty with his son's son, which is where we would be with William Atheling, if we have that continuation going forward, there's not that rival and ultimate, we're jumping to cousins and we're jumping to things like that. If it just keeps going son to son to son to son to son. So I think there's the possibility that it would have been, and not that far-fetched of a possibility, to be a much more peaceful relationship between England and France.
So one of the other relationships that's always intriguing to me in English history is the relationship between England and Scotland.
Yes.
So in the real timeline where Henry I is king, what is the relationship between England and Scotland before the White Ship incident?
So they're related by marriage. Henry's wife, and actually the mother of William, is Matilda of Scotland. She's a Scottish princess. She's actually married to Henry, first of all, for the obvious reasons, to unite the thrones of England and Scotland, to make them in close relationship with each other. But she's actually also descended, she's the granddaughter of a Anglo-Saxon king of England. There had been a previous marriage, so it's not just allying England and Scotland together, but it's also tying those ties back to previous, before Norman invasion happens. It's kind of the, hey, we're just continuing the line of kings from what it was before.
So if William, who's lost on the White Ship, lives, he inherits his father's title as King of England. He's entitled to the rulership or domination of Scotland through the marriage of his mother and English dominance. And this ties back to the pre-Norman invasion sort of legitimacy of an English monarch that's carried through his mother. So all of those things are sort of wrapped up in him as the legitimate heir, where there's not really a question about any of these things if it's him.
Right. When I said Henry I had all his eggs in one basket with William, I really meant it. There was a lot of things riding on William.
So without a William, again in the counterfactual, in the real timeline things go
A little haywire.
But in the theoretical counterfactual timeline that we're talking about here, the fork in time would be William is king, and so all of those eggs, as you describe them in that one basket, stay in that one basket. And theoretically, how is that different than the period that we see that we call the Anarchy?
Theoretically, what happens in the Anarchy is Scotland takes advantage of the chaos that is going on in England. There had been, obviously, and it happens multiple times throughout history, border raids, taking of territory, things like that. So Scotland, the nobles of Scotland, the kings of Scotland kind of say, hey, y'all can't figure out what y'all are doing. That land that used to be ours, we want it back. And y'all aren't really in a position to not fight us on it. So there's retaking of territory, there's this shifting of power back to the hands of Scotland in some instances, because there's this chaos going on in England. Scotland definitely takes advantage of that.
And not to pick on my daughter and the fact that she is a Texan, as am I. She actually, that's right, she said that those Scottish lords use the term y'all to describe what
y'all is a proper noun in Texas, guys.
That's correct. So if you're one of our international listeners, we're just letting you know the flavor that's there. So again, in the alternate timeline, there isn't the same level of anarchy that exists. It's called the Anarchy, but there's also not the same level of contention that exists between Scotland. We already talked about how the relationship with France could have been different. And so eventually Henry II in the real timeline gets Scotland back in line, in order, but he has to go and do that.
Right.
And so in theory, in the counterfactual timeline, William, it never goes away. It's all contained within William. So again, this idea that there wouldn't have been the need to focus energy, attention, effort, resources in putting things back together doesn't have to happen. And
right.
So you actually have a much stronger England that comes out of the backside, maybe now around 1150, 1160 without the Anarchy. It's a very different, unified, stronger, more powerful England that's ready to potentially assert itself even in European politics, not through marriage and through conflict, but through being in a position of strength.
Correct, yeah. To kind of go with that egg metaphor, to keep going with that, the egg has been fractured into multiple pieces. If you have William succeeding to the throne, surviving the White Ship disaster, there's no need to... Henry II has to put those pieces back together, and he does put those pieces back together. But if we have no need for Henry II, England is in a much stronger position going forward. So you might have 1150, 1160, them really dominating and them really asserting their influence not just on their little island, but in Europe as a whole.
Yeah, in fact, one of the interesting things that I was looking at in terms of looking at the background materials we were preparing for the podcast is there's a role-playing game, without getting off way into the weeds here on this particular thing, but in this particular role-playing game, there's a series of things that's put into place that look at alternate histories, if you will. It's this idea of time travel, and there's a departure in the various infinite worlds kind of concept, if you remember, with the idea of the multiverse. Which in some ways our podcast is built upon the concept of the multiverse.
A little bit, yeah.
Something changes, and as a result there's parallel universes where parallel things are happening. Interestingly enough, in that particular role-playing game where there's a multiverse concept, the point of departure for two of the universes that are at war with each other is actually over the loss of William and the sinking of the White Ship. And the reason that I mention that is that in their speculative timeline, so I'll just use now a science fiction role-playing timeline, is that actually England under William conquers parts of France and then goes on to form a massive, almost world empire that's an English-French empire. So we're not the only ones who have thought this is an area of influence. There's some folks who have done some work in the science fiction and gaming area who suggest this point of departure could have resulted in an England that's strong enough to be not just a regional power, not just a power in Europe, but potentially grows to be a world power. Yes. Hundreds of years before we think of England as being master of the seas and a world player.
Yeah, think of Holy Roman Empire just led by England type thing. I mean, it had the potential to get that big.
And so the actual timeline deviates or puts a situation where, as you described it together, the eggs all have to be put back together again. Things have to be reconstituted. If you don't have that, there's obviously not having that. That's the obvious thing, but then there's the benefit of having not done that, being able to move forward, and other things could have happened that could have been much more impactful. We don't know what they are. Now we're really off into speculation, but we could have had a situation where England was exerting its influence because it didn't have to deal with its internal matters for several decades.
Correct.
To me, one of the most interesting concepts here, and of course, Alexis, we're going to let you expound upon this, is we talked before, again, William survives, no Henry II. In fact, that's like the recurring theme of this particular episode, is that's probably the major departure, as you would have had a different eventual succession, no Henry II as we know it. Henry II, known well to history, but his children are probably equally or even more well known to a lot of folks than Henry II. So who are some of Henry II's kids?
Well, two that jump out immediately in my head, of course, Richard I. We all kind of know him. He's the crusading king, but he had this other son, John.
Has there been an English monarch named John since King John?
That would be a resounding no.
No, and one of the euphemisms that we have in English languages, we sometimes refer to the place that people go to relieve themselves as the
John.
Why do we do that?
Well, that would be because of this guy.
Because of King John. So let's focus a little bit upon that. We've never had another King John. John Lackland, I believe, is his actual name, if we know him there. So he's actually the youngest son of Henry and Eleanor. And eventually does succeed to the throne. Eventually becomes King of England. Some of those other things that are all happening there about the questions about claims to French territory, the lands that were Eleanor's, those types of things. But probably King John is known first and foremost for what particular document that we think of as being important in history?
One that I actually asked to see for my birthday when it came to Houston a few years ago, the Magna Carta.
That's right. We actually went down to see the touring, one of the original copies of the Magna Carta that was on tour.
Yeah, signs of a history geek. You asked to go see a historical document for your birthday, guys.
Yeah, so that's 1215, the signing of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta being Latin for Great Charter. And what the Magna Carta is an agreement between now King John as the English monarch and barons and nobles about what their rights are going to be relative to his rights. And that has to do, for example, with taxation, and has to do with his ability to impose royal authority on the nobles. And the reason we think of it as being important in the English and Western democratic tradition that comes down to America is it's sort of viewed as being one of the early constitutional documents. It is an early constitutional document for the English Constitution, which is not a written constitution like the American Constitution, but is still an understood agreement about how things are going to work. So the Magna Carta limits the king's power relative to, in this case, the nobles. By extension, what ultimately happens to that limitation of the king's power?
So, if we're limiting the power of the king in terms of the nobles, ultimately that carries down. You've mentioned briefly, the English Constitution. It's based on precedent. So, if we're limiting the power of the king over the nobles. Ultimately, that trickles down to the fact that we're limiting the power of the king over the common people.
Right.
So it ultimately becomes, the Magna Carta is kind of what we think is the bedrock of what ultimately becomes democracy, common law, and what ultimately is the basis for American democracy and democracies all over the world.
Right. So this idea of certainly English democracy becoming American democracy, I use the term Western democracy.
Yes.
It owes its roots to the Magna Carta. Mm-hmm. So the Magna Carta, we would all agree, is an important document.
Absolutely.
The Magna Carta becomes necessary where the nobles feel the need to assert their rights, primarily because the fact that John is not exactly the best of kings in terms of how he treats them.
Let's use the word inept.
Okay, inept. That may be a kind word from what I understand in most history readings and what I remember of John. Again, where this ties back to the counterfactual, what we're talking about here in today's episode of the podcast is there is no King John if there is no King Henry II. There is no King Henry II if William survives because there is no sinking of the White Ship. So we're not arguing that there wouldn't be the Magna Carta and there wouldn't be democracy today necessarily if the White Ship doesn't sink. But we might be arguing that it would have taken a different course or would have come to being in a different form than we've seen it now. Is that a fair thing from your point of view, Alexis?
I think so, absolutely. We get the Magna Carta and we get what becomes modern democracy because we have, let's use the word inept. We could probably use worse words, but let's use that one. Because we have an inept king on the throne. We're not saying that we wouldn't ultimately get the ideas of democracy, but it might have come about in a more organic way, not this stopgap, we gotta fix this, we gotta put a stop to this, which ultimately happened with the Magna Carta. Maybe it was more of this working together with the king and the barons instead of the barons going, nah, stop this.
Right. In fact, the way that what I remember, my degree happens to be in political science, so I've studied this, and what I remember is the Magna Carta, we think of it now as the Great Charter. It was signed under duress by John.
He didn't want to sign it.
Exactly. And it was the result of what the nobles viewed as being abuses by John that led to this. And so I like your use of the term organic. While this idea of a reduction of absolute autonomy, absolute monarchy may have eventually been reduced over time, it wouldn't have come. This wasn't at the tip of a gun, or at sword point, but this was at the point of a rebellion, and the only way to quell the rebellion from John's point of view was to agree to these terms that he never wanted to agree to in terms of the Magna Carta and the Great Charter, ceding authority to the nobles.
Correct. He essentially signed the Magna Carta to keep his throne.
Right. And the result of that, I guess we would argue, looking from the long view back, is it eventually led to what most people view as being a positive development, the idea of democratic principles, of empowering the people or their representatives. The nobles, I think, would have told you at that time they represented the people, not in the same way that we think of modern representative democracy, but that's how they would have argued. It wasn't just their rights. It was their rights to represent the people that were their vassals. This is still a feudal situation. But eventually that leads to, again, the concept we've talked here about of modern democracy. And so it may be a little bit of a far stretch, but it's not a total far stretch to say that part of what we owe in terms of the idea of modern democracy to is to the sinking of
the White Ship. And
the particular passenger that happened to be on board, the passenger of note, which was the all your eggs in one basket heir William. That's how he'll be forever known in my mind because of this podcast today. And so while that may seem, that's a long view stretch out, and it's the result of several generations. In fact, it's not until 1215 that the Magna Carta is signed. Again, we're talking about the sinking of the White Ship being
almost 100 years prior in 1120.
Yeah. But yet one of the long-term impacts is you end up with King John, and you end up with the Magna Carta. And because of the Magna Carta, you actually end up with something I think that a lot of people view as being a net positive. John's a horrible king, but because he's a horrible king, a net positive comes out of that, and eventually this concept of, as you said, precedent and English common law and the things that are built upon that. The American Constitution comes along later as a formalization of those things. I mean, these things all flow together as the documents of democracy throughout history. And so, you may not think that the sinking of a ship off the coast now almost 900 years ago makes that much of a difference, but it makes a difference.
It absolutely does.
Yeah, so that's a long way to get around, and I know we wandered through this alternative history, because as you go back to some of these events in history, it's tough to know exactly what the timeline would have been, but we may owe democracy as we know it today in this form to the White Ship. So the next.
So what I heard, one article described the medieval booze cruise.
Okay, yeah, that's a whole other thing we didn't even talk about. Was there was a question about whether I guess that the reason the ship sank, or at least one.
They were having some parties.
Yeah, one theory is that the entire crew may have been
inebriated,
and which again is probably not what you want to do when you're carrying the future king of England on board. But that's certainly what happened there. All right, so again, we hope you've enjoyed this sort of winding path down through this particular part of English history as we look at the historical what-if of what would have happened if the White Ship had not sank, and thus as a result there would not have been the period of the anarchy known in England. Any closing thoughts before we close out the podcast, Alexis?
Not really, just, yeah, it's interesting to think about. I'm kind of just, as I'm wrapping my brain around it, it's interesting to think about how this one thing that you know the after effects of it, but to know the actual the flashpoint.
Right.
It's interesting to think about if that one flashpoint hadn't happened, what ultimately wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, the other thing, just before we close out, just because this popped up during the research that I was doing, the other interesting thing about what happened there is that William was on the ship. It goes down. The Stephen that you've referred to was supposed to be
on the ship
and was not. And so again, the historical fork could have been what would have happened if both of them had actually been on board, because then in theory you could have also had the same outcome that we've talked about, just from a different perspective of there would have been no one to challenge the Matilda claim, and thus the logical flow that Henry I would have intended could have happened. So this is also, again, we didn't go down that path. This is one of those interesting historical what-ifs. Who was on the ship, who was not on the ship, both played in this. Because you could have also had another version of the same alternate history, just with the ship still goes down, it's just that Stephen happens to be...
Yeah, who goes down with it.
Goes down with the ship, and so as a result of that, yes, you lose that interesting sort of all-in-one era that you've talked about here in William, but you also lose the one who created so much of the anarchy and the disruption, because there would have been no one to really take up the cause of challenging what Henry had brokered as Matilda's claim to the throne. So, the other interesting part of the White Ship is who went down on the White Ship and who didn't go down on the White Ship. And of course that leads to all kinds of speculation in novelizations and other tellings of history. Maybe he intentionally didn't get on the White Ship, and this may in fact be a form of mass murder. But that's for another time and for a history podcast and not an alternative podcast. So again, we hope you've enjoyed this little journey down probably a much lesser known part of English history, certainly lesser known to me, and I consider myself to know a pretty good bit about history. But an important part, because ultimately, as we talked about, it may lead to the Magna Carta. So once again, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. As we close, we'd like to remind you that there's a lot of interesting things you can do for us if you visit our website. The website is aforkintimepodcast.com. The A in front of the fork is important. Podcast at the end before the .com is important to get you to the right place. At the website, you'll find all of our episodes, link to all of the episodes, as well as some information about the episodes, and a number of different ways to give us feedback. There's a general feedback form there. There's a feedback that will allow you to suggest topics, which is something we would certainly encourage. We know some of the things that are of interest to us, but if you'd like to tour history other than that of England, perhaps you can suggest some things that would fit into that ilk, and we would happily take them on. But one of the other things you can do there at the website, and I would really, really encourage you to take some time. This is almost, I don't want to say that I'm begging, but I'm pleading, is we have a listener survey that we put there. And if you do it on any page of the web page, any page of the website, you'll find a link that says Complete Listener Survey. You can take the survey directly there or get linked over to the SurveyMonkey engine, which is what we're using. It's a short 10-question survey. Probably won't take you more than about 5 minutes.
Not even.
If that, to complete, unless there is room for you provide some free-form feedback, which we would certainly welcome there. But we really would encourage you, particularly if you're a regular listener to the podcast, go and complete that survey for us. We want to get the feedback. You'll see from the questions that are there, they're designed to help us sort of guide what the podcast will become. In its early days here, we've tried a number of different formats, different links, different ways of doing things. We'd like to know what you like and what you don't like. And the best way we know to get that information is to ask you. But when we ask you, we need you to give us an answer back. And so, again, I would just really, really encourage you, if you haven't done so, if you're a first-time listener, go and do it. If you've listened to every episode, go and do it. We want the feedback that's there, and one of the best ways to do that is through the structured listener survey. Some of the other things that you can do there on the website are links to the various podcatchers of choice, so how you can find us and subscribe to us. One of the things I would encourage, if you haven't done so, is actually using whatever mechanism, if you use an app or whatever it is you use to aggregate your podcast, actually subscribe to the podcast. It'll magically appear.
It makes it so easy.
It does make it so easy. You don't have to go and click anything on the web more than once. It'll just magically show up in your podcatcher of choice, and you'll have the episodes there. Mostly we release, as you know, on Thursday mornings. So once a week, boom, there's your A Fork in Time that you can either listen to or ignore. It's completely up to you. But we'd encourage you to do that so that you don't miss an episode. Also, we will occasionally release special episodes, so you may not know that something has happened. We've occasionally adjusted the release date because we're tying to something. Most recently, we did that for the anniversary of September 11th. So subscribing is a good thing to do. One of the other things that you can do through the various podcatchers, particularly we're talking about Apple Podcasts / iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, they have the ability for you to do ratings and reviews, and we would really appreciate if you could give us that feedback as well. The listener feedback on our website comes to us. That's sort of an in-house way of giving us feedback, but those reviews help other folks find us on the search engines, and when they're looking at, should I even spend time with this podcast, I check out the reviews that their podcasts have been given. So if you like what you see here and you want to encourage others to join the community, you can help with that by giving your review there. Even if it's a negative rating, we will take anything. Just if you would take the time to go and do that, we would greatly appreciate it. And again, it helps promote the podcast, but also helps us give feedback to make the podcast not just what we want to do, but what our listeners really want us to do. And as we've already said a number of times, my wife actually gets on to me about thanking people so much, but I recognize that you taking some of your day, even if you're doing something else, is one of the greatest gifts that you could give us. And so we thank you for your time and your attention. And particularly if you're a regular listener, it's sort of neat to me when I'll be candid, when I look at some of the statistics that our podcast hosting site shows, and I see all over the world where people are listening from, places I know that I will never probably get to go personally, but I'm interacting, not in a direct way, but in an important way with somebody there. And that's just cool to me. So we appreciate you, and I know that's a gift of your time. So we just again want to say thanks. I won't say thanks again, except to say thank you. The other thing that I'll mention here, Alexis and I were actually talking off podcast. That's going to be the new term, by the way, Lex.
I'm good with that.
Not off air, but off podcast. We were talking off podcast about the fact that we enjoy doing this. This is something that we do as a father and daughter, both because we share a passion for history. We both enjoy that. That's something we've had in common, and it's something that we can share together. So we enjoy doing these episodes together. For those of you that listen to the podcast know that we do separate episodes from time to time. But it really is sort of a family thing for us. And we think of it as, I often refer to Alexis as my co-host. She's the other host. And of course, when she's doing one of the podcasts on her own, she is the host. But one of the things that we're actually trying to do is convince my wife, Alexis's mom, to join us for an episode. And so this is actually us making a secret plea here at the end of the podcast. If you've stuck through to the end, think of this as like a Marvel movie for the scene at the end of the credits.
This is your mission.
This is your mission. Is if you give us the feedback there and you'd like to hear my wife participate maybe on one of the podcast episodes. She happens to be medically trained, and so I think there's some interesting things we could do in terms of historical medical what-ifs. And she would be an excellent resource to join us for those podcasts. So if that's something you'd like to be a co-conspirator in, and here's the deal, she may not listen to this podcast, so she won't even know. She actually doesn't listen to every episode. But if you'd like her to do that, one of the things you could do is in the feedback forms or in the survey or in the other places, put that note there, and we will have evidence that this is not just something that Alexis and I are doing. Would you agree with that, Alexis?
Yes.
Okay.
I fully endorse this plan.
Okay. So if you're one of the loyal listeners who stuck to the end of the credits situation here, you can help us out with that, and we would certainly encourage that you do so. Anything you want to say as we're closing out, Lex?
I will say that my mom is not a history person per se, but my dad is completely right. She does have medical training and medical background, so I'm really curious. So yeah, help us with that mission.
Yeah, and the other thing I would mention here, and again, I'm a little surprised Alexis didn't mention it, but I will do it for her, is that one of the things you can do on the podcast are the various ways to connect to us on social media. And Alexis, in her day job, her real job is in marketing and deals with social media every day. And I know that one of the ways that we've actually been able to grow the podcast to some degree is just simply through Facebook and through Twitter and the other ways that people that we know and people that we don't even know are sharing that with us. So if you have a chance, so you can share us on Facebook, share us on Twitter. Actually have a conversation with a real live person who you know is a podcast listener and say, hey, have you checked this out? All of those are just ways to promote the show. One of the things that I sort of committed to when we started this about almost 5 months ago now, it's hard to believe it's been that long. Holy moly. Is that I would not ever spend a dime if I could possibly avoid it on promoting the podcast. That's not what the podcast was to be about. I know there are a lot of YouTube channels and podcasts that are about making money. And that's fine. Those are great. I participate in some of those. I support some of those, particularly the ones that I enjoy. But as Alexis and I have said a number of times, I haven't mentioned the Patreon page. By law, I think I'm required to do that here. And one of the things that you can do at our website is get the link to our Patreon page. It's also in the show notes. And you can actually support the podcast financially. Help offset some of the costs by becoming a patron or supporter. We didn't get into this to make money. If we did, we made a very, very, very poor choice. But a podcast does require some money to sustain itself, to host and do some of the other things that are there. So if you'd like to participate that way, we would welcome it. Again, your time is the greatest gift that you can give. But showing us other ways, financial support being one of them, is an indicator that we really are doing something that you value. It can be, and a small amount is a small amount, but what it represents is a big commitment, and we do appreciate that. So we would ask you to follow through on that as well. So as we get ready to close out here for this particular episode of A Fork in Time, I'm going to again say, perhaps for the last time, my wife chides me about saying this too frequently, but thank you. We appreciate you.
I don't think you could say it enough.
I don't think we can, although we probably do say it too much. She always is right. That's the other thing you find here by staying late in the podcast. So, again, we thank you and appreciate the fact that you've given us the gift of your time today. So this is Don signing off, and also
Alexis.
And as we close here, we're going to do, as we've closed so many of the podcasts, remind you that if you happen upon A Fork in Time, take it. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.